you're setting a multi-generational trajectory, and that can work in business, that can work in life, that can work in everything. And it's based upon your choices. If you decided as a grandfather to make poor choices, that'll influence your children, right?
Right.
And
Absolutely.
that'll influence, well, that same thing happens in business. If as a business leader, I decide to make a poor choice, all the people that are working there, their lives will be affected by that.
Yeah. And consequently, you make good, wise decisions. It sets
That's exactly
foundations
right.
for your kids and your children.
So that goes back to the foundation of faith. We're going to have fear. It's inherent in us, but we can choose what to fear. And so then as I study the Bible, foundation of faith, God tells us to fear something, actually, believe it or not. Even God, who is the creator of all things, tells us to fear something. And what does he tell us to fear? Him.
Welcome to Season 1, Episode 1 of ReedFlections, a podcast on life, leadership, and learning. Good day, everyone. My name is Art Calderon. I am here in the heartland of America. I'd like to introduce my good friend, Reed Nyffeler. Reed and I have been friends for many years. And welcome to our podcast. Reed has been talking about starting this podcast for some time. His family has reminded him continuously that he's talked a lot about it, but finally, he's pulling the trigger and we're doing a podcast. Now, Reed, you are in addition to being a father and a husband, you're a CEO of a global company that has grown exponentially over really a short period of time. You're involved socially, and you have a lot of things to keep you busy. Tell me why in the world, with all this stuff you got going on, you decided you wanted to start a podcast.
Well, Art, yes, I've been leading an organization for about 15 or 16 years here, a global organization. And one of the things that kind of stood back as I get other leaders that are looking to me and saying, hey, how did you do it? And one of the ideas was to put a podcast together that could be just tips and techniques all the way through. And I would call myself really a practitioner, somebody that I'm not really someone that's spent a ton of time researching theories or testing theories, or somebody that's really deep into theology beyond self-study, and or even somebody that's try to put all those pieces together. But this podcast is an opportunity to say, hey, this is the template that's worked for me, and really that's why I put it together. And I think the life component of it all is we live regardless of where we're at. So maybe the listeners are out there and they're just saying, hey, I'm not where I want to be in life. And so that's why I thought that's the first category. And then the second category is leadership. I mean, I think leadership is influence. And so to whatever degree we have anyone that we talk to on a regular basis, we're influencing them positive or negative. And so we can always work on our leadership skills. And then the way to improve both life and leadership, I believe, is learning. And so that's why that's the third category. We cannot make any progress in life without learning something new. And so that's the intent of the podcast. And so it's my hope that, obviously, this being the first episode, that we work through, really principles that are foundational throughout our lives that we can apply to leadership and learning.
All right. Now, as you know, there is a lot pulling our attention. In our society, we have, social media is crazy. But everyone, it seems to me, to be pulling for our passion, right? Even if it's like a grocery store or a soft drink or a gas station, they want our attention, they want our time, they want our passion, they want our to be a member of the rewards club. Every time you go, you slide that card. Hate that. Some of it's legitimate, but most of it is not. And I think about as leaders, particularly in our family with our kids. Between the two of us, we have 8 children. It's a lot of procreation. I have a grandchild,
Well,
actually, so I'm winning there. Just to let you know. How do we, as leaders in our families, how do we help our children to clarify priorities? Because it can be tough. And what's your process? I guess a better way to ask is, what is your process for clarifying and choosing life priorities?
yeah, I would think the first thing is look at what doesn't work, right? If we, in order for us to pick a priority, sometimes we do that out of preference or emotion. And then we clearly see that doesn't work.
I think emotion's big.
Yeah, I think that's a big one, right? Because you would see that publicly is the case. And so to your point of a lot of things demanding our time, if we don't decide where to allocate our time, things will demand our time. And
Right.
that's the purpose of marketing and everything else. And so I call that the default life. Because by default, if we haven't decided what we want, it's going to be decided for us, right? Our priorities will be decided for us by the media, by our friends, by those peer groups, by all those other things. And so if I'm raising my children and I don't intentionally help them understand the priorities for their sake, they'll fall into the default, just like every other
Right.
human would. And so then we look at it and say, okay, where should we base our priorities? Right? If default, meaning we listen to social media, TV, our friends, you name the category or the moment, we default to the moment, then that will be our life and our priority be chosen for us. But if we have an opportunity to choose our priorities, how would we choose our priorities? And so, when I first thought of that, as I was theorizing internally, I said, if I'm going to choose a priority, I want to be something that won't change, right? I mean, that's the power of a priority is it should always be the priority. And then there's really three categories that are things. The first is eternal. The best priorities are eternal, transcendent, and universal. And I'll break each of those three down. So eternal is it's a priority that I can have for my entire life. The eternity of that is saying, since I'm on this earth, what is a priority I can have that's eternal? And then the second, any priority around us personally, um, the society would end, right? I mean, you mentioned the 8 children. If our families, if we did not have children, our name would not be extended beyond to a grandchild, like in your example. And so then it can't be just about me, right? Because then I wouldn't get married if it was just about me. It's too easy. I wouldn't have kids, et cetera. So that's the transcendent component. And then universal, right? I mean, obviously we're doing a podcast. I have a family, I have work and other priorities. So I should be inherently who I am wherever I am, right? And so that's the universal, whether I'm at work, whether I'm in my faith environment, whether I'm at home, or whether I'm just in a relaxed environment. I need to be, that's the universal application. And I truly believe that our stress in life is the difference between the perception of what we want people to believe who we are and who we really are. So if there's a disparity between who you say you are and who you really are, that's where your stress is.
When you say who you really are, you mean how people perceive you,
Yeah, the
what
the
people would say about
perception,
you.
there's perception, right? So they may perceive me as a CEO of an
Uh-huh.
organization. And so they're going to perceive what they believe a CEO of an organization should be. Then there's Reed, right? And that's who I really am, immaterial of the title that I might have or immaterial of the responsibility I have. And so if I'm trying to live up to their perception of what a CEO of this organization is,
Must be exhausting, right?
and that's not who I am, that's where stress is at because there's expectations around perception, right? Et cetera. And so then I recognize that the person in front of me is not necessarily going to necessarily be internal, right? Meaning if I'm meeting someone on the street and they see me as by title CEO, that's not going to be an eternal relationship. That's just a moment. So if I change who I am for that moment, that's stressful to manage all the crowd that's there. And so that's where the power of priorities come in.
Do you see that with social media? All these expectations of how you should be from people who don't even really know you?
Absolutely. And I would say, even as you look at social media, it's truly an instant in time, right? I mean, whether you're graduating college and there's an instant in time that you get appropriate GPA, or you start a business, or you're having quick success, or maybe you start a family and how's our first Christmas or seasons. So it's an instant in time. They're only seeing a snapshot that honestly you're offering to them. And they're building their perceptions as a result of that. So inherently, if you put all those pictures together, is that who you really are, or is there a much deeper part of that and person as to who you are? And so that's where then the priority comes in. And so if our priorities are based upon eternal, transcendent, and universal, then I sat back and I said, okay, how do I start my priorities? And the other thing I would say about priorities is, if you don't have them numbered in order, then how will you prioritize? And for example, if you have two choices and you're at a restaurant and you have a menu choice.
I'm going to get both of them, but go ahead.
Okay, fair enough. Maybe you can manage two priorities at once too, Art, because I know you can manage a plate with multiple priorities. And so that's why you have to have them in order. You have to sequence them so that given the choice, when you pull up to that restaurant and the meal is available, that's your choice. And so that's a priority in life as well. That if you're stuck with a choice around decision, and so my first priority is my faith. And I recognize that that's something that even before I had a family, right, which would be my second priority, which of course we'll discuss in greater degree. If I did not have a priority of faith, would my family change? What my spouse would be somebody different if I didn't have a priority of faith. My time allocation would be different with regard to raising my family. The choices I would make in life would be different, and that would either push away my family or draw in my family. And so that's something that I recognized early on that can be eternal, transcendent, and universal. And then before I finally chose that for myself, I said, okay, let's take this away from myself in a moment and say, has it worked for others? Because if we're doing something and we're the first one to do something And then we don't know the outcome. But as I look throughout history, and we have the benefit in this case of 2,000 years of history to say, okay, if I look at the Bible as a principal example for my life there, I would say, okay, it didn't necessarily lead the worldly life. If we study all the characters in the Bible, that wasn't the worldly life they necessarily would have hoped for or wanted. I mean, many times they were always confronted with challenges.
So you're talking about the heroes of the Bible that ended up having really tough lives, and
That's
some of
right.
them even were killed and so forth. They didn't have this great prosperous life that
Yeah.
we maybe would have chosen for them
Yeah,
otherwise.
none of them were lottery winners, right? None of them won an athletic championship. Maybe David, with regard to Goliath, I suppose, but they weren't, social media stars in today's present. They weren't your TV stars, right? They were none of this global acclaim. At the same time, they're the lives we study, right? That stood back to me and said, "Wait a minute." These are the lives that are documented and studied every week by a lot of people, even though they didn't have the worldwide acclaim. And so that's where I say, okay, as a foundation of faith, that is something that's eternal, and there's a template for it that's been effective that we still talk about that really changed cultures and climates and activities. And so that's why that's my first priority is a foundation. And then that all the rest are based upon that, right? Whether I choose my family, which is my second priority, my work, which is my third priority, if I didn't have that faith, where would I go? Right? What would be the basis of that foundation? And really foundations are super critical. And I think of two stories, one a personal example and one a public example that show the power of foundation. And so I had an opportunity to go to Bar Harbor, Maine. And, I'd never been there before. So I thought maybe that's the first bar. The sailors were thirsty, So they go there and they go to
They
Bar
like to
Harbor
drink, I
and they know,
understand.
hey, where are the drinks? It's in Bar Harbor naturally. But when I got there, what I realized is no, 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 no. It's not at all about that. It's actually a big sandbar that becomes illuminated. It comes out of it's visible when the tide comes out. And so elevation in the tide can be up to 16 feet, I believe. And so the tide can go quite a distance as a result. And so this sandbar in the middle will get you out to an island. And I thought, wow, that's pretty crazy. Because how do you plan a house when the water on a daily basis changed by 12 feet? So if you are in the sandbar in the day and you want to fish, you're right there. But then the water comes
You
up and
better
you're
get
flooding
out
your
of there.
basement. That's right. And so picking where your foundation was critical. But then as I had an opportunity to hop in a little plane to see lighthouses around there. And then I realized that's why lighthouses are there, is because the tide changes so dramatically that if you're there during the day and you're going through, you can see the rocks. But then if the tide changes 12 feet, the sandbar and rocks are now exposed. So you need that foundation. So when they were choosing their foundation for the lighthouse, they had to take that all in consideration. And to me, that's a foundation of faith is one, what's always going to be there? That lighthouse needs to be there 365, 24/7 and serviceable. Second, it needs to illuminate a path. And to me, that's what a foundation of faith is here's what it was. And there's all sorts of rocks, just like we see in Maine, that your boat can crash and it can be sunk in
Right.
the bottom of the ocean if you didn't have that foundation set aside in the right area. And so that's the power of the foundation of faith. And then a personal example, when I was a teenager, one of the first jobs I took was actually building basements. And, part of the reason I took the job was not at all for foundation, but it was very illuminating. And that was because it paid well, right? That's why we take jobs as
That's
teenagers,
right.
right? So it paid well. And quite frankly, at the time, as many teenagers, I was, trying to get in shape. So I thought, well, I'll just carry around these blocks all day in the sun, get a tan, get in shape and earn some good money. But what I didn't realize is all the preparation to put that first stone down that went there. And so we go lay a basement. And so the foundation is just like in any house, right? You'd have your footings there. And then on top of that, you'd lay that first block. And so by the time we got there, all the footings were laid down. And then we'd have to put that first block. And, you just think, just lay it anywhere. It's no big deal, right? It's on the footings that's there. No, we were measuring off the lot line. So there would be a lot that was defined and there's pins in the ground and you'd measure off that. Why? Because someone's buying that and they're going to live there for 150 years. And so if it's not on their property, or it's not centered on their property, that'll disrupt everything else. So your framing would be uneven. The nature of how it faces, that's a foundation of faith to me. If I don't lay that first cornerstone perfectly, every other block that I build in my life will be maligned. And I mean, there's people that have had, a early rough upbringing, right? They had a challenge and that foundation was rocky, right? And then they can make a choice at whatever stage in life to clarify that foundation and lay that first stone and rebuild again. I mean,
And so
as
that
well.
that stone you're talking about
Yeah,
is a foundation that you have in your faith in God.
right.
That everything else is built off of that. That has to be the thing that is everything else is measured against.
Yeah, that's an anchor stone, right? And I think, it's not just, I think so many times we do not get the benefit from deciding our faith. We get the benefit from living our faith. There's so many people that have stated principles, no matter what it is, but not lived. We can go state, I want to go on a diet, and not live it. We don't get the benefit of it.
Done that
We can say,
before.
I want to get, no comment. We can state we want to get an education,
Uh-huh.
right? And not do it. We can say we are educated and not apply it. And so I think the difference is not stating that
Right.
priority, it's
Not-
living that
Not
priority.
being the loudest about it, but
Right.
actually living it.
I think also on that other side is we will be judged by the priorities we lived, not the priorities we stated, right? If it's a family, if it's someone at the business, they're not going to say, well, you said this. They're only going to say that to hold me accountable. They're going to live off how I lived.
Right.
They're going to hold me accountable to what I said. And so we try in those circumstances. So then if I am living a life around my foundation, then I can orient accordingly. Instead of saying we should put that in the right place, but I'm not going to,
Right. Good.
right? We can have the best intentions,
Yeah.
but we need to have the process and practice there. And that's really what a foundation is. It's not just saying it, it's doing it,
Uh-huh.
right?
Now you talked about change. You and I have been alive long enough to know how constant change is.
And you've been alive a lot longer than me, so you probably have even more perspective
Oh
on that.
yes, I remember the old days
Yeah.
before you use a mouse. I didn't know what that was, but technology, people. You and I have seen people come and go, even from your company. Language changes. You got to stay in touch with the young people to keep hip like me, Reed. They even have organizations that will bring in consultants to help them navigate change. That's like their only job, change navigator. Why is it important to have a reliable, unchanging, foundational priority?
Yeah, I think because then you always know where you're orienting off of, right? And even if you look at cities, we'll use cities as an example. Their water is usually where they're based on. Most people found a city off the water. And if you look at that as a foundation of where the city is, I tour Europe at times, and every time you can see the center of a city is usually around water because it's so critical. That's the source of life. And so then the city would orient. That's why you see a lot of circles in the middle of cities, is because they're orienting around that water source. And the closer you go to the water source, the more valuable the things. As we come to America, it's on rivers because that is something that's always there that'll be necessary for life. Now, if we look at over the 200-300 years that America has been founded, what has been on that water's changed, right? You may have had a canoe at the time, but now you see these speedboats sitting on the water. Then you see the house might have been a shack, but now it's they tear those houses down, etc. But what hasn't
Casino.
changed? The casino, yeah, the casinos here in Nebraska. But I think that's exactly what happens is that's where you always know, go to the water.
Right.
And, I was with a friend who's a pilot, and they even navigate by that because they know it's not going to change. They said most airports follow the water. And so it's a navigable resource that
Even the
will
airports.
always be there. Right. Majority of airports, he said, if you want to find an airport and you're in trouble, follow the river. Usually you find an airport. And to me, it's like, they know. That's just a stated foundation that no matter where you're at, you always know where it's going to orient. So even though the city may change in that airport example, even though the years may change and what you're putting on that water may change,
Demographics.
the demographics may change, you're always going to that water source. And to me, that's a foundation. That's where you begin your orientation, right? Is where's the water? And ultimately, how do I go from there?
Now, what I've been hearing a lot, I'm sure you have too, is this idea that pride in oneself, and that's going to be the way to I don't know, be purposeful in life.
Yeah.
But I've heard you talk about humility, which is the opposite of that. That humility is some sort of foundation. Describe how humility is a foundational priority for your life.
Yeah, so I fundamentally believe you're only going to go as far as your humility will take you, right? Many times we live in a world that boasts and says what they do. I mean, that's social media really creates an environment where you can tell everybody about who you are and what you do, or what you want them to believe that you are. But you only go as far as humility will take you. And so that seems like an easy thing to say, but I always put my theories and test it in the practice. If you're sitting with someone and they are always talking about how great they are and how excellent they are, How long do you want to listen to that? And how many times they go retell the story about when they won a championship 20 years ago, right? Or all those other circumstances. And so then in that other, let's flip it around. Now, if someone is there and they are saying, hey, in my case, I've had success, and part of this podcast for me is to help other entrepreneurs and or leaders or people that are trying to live a better life to share principles that have worked for me. And I'm not doing that out of a sense of pride. I'm doing that out as a sense of a way to hear a message we may have ever heard before. Right. And part of that is me consuming content. I see these messages that we're talking about that are constantly out there that are saying, just go self promote and then you'll be successful. Get the followers. But in the end, you realize that's empty, right? You realize that, okay, so I go get all the followers. And why are they following me? Because of my folly? Because I'm going to entertain them? Because they aspire to be like me, but what I'm doing is an external thing? Or can I choose to do better, right? I don't want to be better or the perception to be better, but I want to do better, right? So then who's following me? And so I think as a result of humility is saying, hey, I'm here to invest and learn. And so the foundation of your humility only goes as far as it is. And so, one of the principles I have, and I communicate this anytime I meet somebody new, is who are you, why are you here, and what are your plans for this year? Humility to me says, don't tell me about myself. I have a lot of calls with prospective business partners, and I can tell you they maybe remember my name after that call because I'm always asking those three questions. Who are you? How would you characterize yourself? What is it about you that you identify as? Second, why are we together? What is the purpose of our partnership? And so that's me to understand, how can I help, right? And then the third one is how can I help you from here? Where do you want to get to, right? And part of this podcast is my purpose statement. That's the same thing that is the case. Through intuitive interaction, propel leaders beyond their self-imposed barriers to live out their unique purpose in life. So this is an opportunity for me to do that at scale, right? Because I'm going to intuitively interact with the general public, bring principles to this podcast that I can share other leaders that may just be listening, that can otherwise advance their life, leadership, and learning in any of those three areas.
And you get a kick out of that when you can see someone breaking through that and growing, and you talked about these barriers, breaking through those barriers. Doesn't that give you a sense of purpose or a little renewed energy to keep doing?
Yeah, and I think, we talked about your grandchildren, right? I mean, you're setting a multi-generational trajectory, and that can work in business, that can work in life, that can work in everything. And it's based upon your choices. If you decided as a grandfather to make poor choices, that'll influence your children, right?
Absolutely.
And that'll influence, well, that same thing happens in business. If as a business leader, I decide to make a poor choice, all the people that are working there, their lives will be affected by that.
Yeah. And consequently, you make good, wise decisions. It sets
That's
foundations
exactly right.
for your kids and your children.
So that goes back to the foundation of faith.
Mm-hmm.
If I am using, in my case, the Bible as context to say, hey, here's how a decision has previously been made, and here's the ramifications of that, and whether that's kings as leaders, whether that's judges as arbiters of the law, or whether that's establishing rules that change behavior, all of those are foundations that are based upon faith that I can apply to business, because in the end, it's managing people. And there's kingdoms that were much bigger than whatever I'm ever able to build. That's documented in the Bible as principles to show how that works over time.
Right. So you talked a lot about God. You talked a lot about, I guess the theory or the idea. Now tell me something practical. It's a two-part question here. Tell me about a decision that you really knew God helped you with. He led you to make your decision. And how do you know it was God's leading and not just Reed imposing his own thoughts and desires?
Yeah, first of all, I think we always think of God leading us somewhere,
Mm-hmm.
but sometimes he tells us to leave somewhere.
Okay.
And so if we look at leave, and I think as humans, we want to know the destination we're choosing, right? We're not going to just randomly drive in a car and say, I'm going on vacation. Where are you going? No idea. I'm just leaving the garage and I'll tell you when I get there, right?
Yeah.
That's not, prevailing wisdom. But we want God to tell us that too. We want him to tell us, tell me the destination. I want to see a picture just like a vacation. I want to see what my life will be like. And we're waiting for God to clarify that beautiful picture we see on a vacation destination and us, in a cabana, soaking in the sun or whatever.
Not really a step of faith at that point.
No, it's not, right? And so I think the first thing is we have to understand, and that's what happened with me when I started the business I'm in now. God said, I'm telling you to leave. I'm not leading you somewhere. I'm telling you to leave. And I remember waking up that morning
And were you married at the time?
Of course, I had
Oh my
a
goodness.
6, 4, and 2-year-old, and I was
Oh
the
my
so my
goodness.
wife has always stayed at home raising our children, which is way more difficult a job than mine.
Uh-huh.
I will say that. So I would come. I remember waking up and that morning, and she's working with the kids, and I said, "Honey, today's the day I'm leaving this organization." And she's like, "I trust you."
Wow.
And she says, "I trust you." And I said, "Well, why is that?" She said, "Well, you've always made your decisions based on that foundation of faith." So now, for the first, we were probably married at 10 years at that time. And she says, "One thing I know, that you are not making that on emotion." It goes back to that foundation of faith that she came alongside of. I had a foundation of faith before I met my wife. She had seen that manifested in our marriage. And then she knew that I was making that decision on the other side. And so here she's like, "Well, where's our income going to be after you quit today?" I mean, I needed health insurance. That was gone that day. Right. And I had no job lined up. And I mean, at the time, I was successful in the organization. It was just clear that day. I mean, abundantly clear it was time to leave. And so sometimes we think God is leading us somewhere. Sometimes he tells us to leave somewhere.
So
And
you
so I
got
think
you
that's
got
the
to
first point.
express that faith and
That's right.
saying, okay, I don't have the whole picture. I don't know where I'm going, but I know I have to leave whatever
That's
the
right.
place or even the emotional place that I'm at or the physical place that I'm at, leave it.
And some people will stay somewhere they know they should leave because they haven't seen where they're going to end up.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's why it's critical, right? And so that's the first step, is you have to leave somewhere so you can let go. Now we're in that open area of faith because we've left somewhere, and this is where God can communicate with us. Because if we're still in that environment that I was in at work, in that environment that was clouding my judgment, clarity, and all the
Because
priorities,
it's comfortable,
that's
you
right.
know it, you have it under control, you don't really need any help.
And this is where I had to make that decision on priority, because if I would have stayed there, I would have stayed there for my family.
Hmm.
I would have gutted it out, because then that's where now my priorities are being tested,
Hmm.
because I was leaving on account of faith, because the world would see the decision on my family. In fact, I came home that day, and I said I had left the organization. I remember one of my neighbors coming up to me like, "What are you doing?" Didn't have a foundation of faith. They're like, "You have 3 children at home," because I didn't have my 4th yet.
Uh-huh.
"And your wife stays at home. How are you going to survive? What's going to happen?" Because their priorities were not foundations of faith.
Yeah.
And so yet my wife on the other side was drawn in as a result of that. And so then there's a foundation of faith. And then when I'm in that waiting, in that period of finding, that's when it was illuminated. And the business opportunity that stumbled upon me was because someone had recommended me, because they saw the way I lived. He said, "I saw what you did in this previous business. I want to introduce you to someone." And it introduced me to someone, and then boom, that was the next opportunity. And because I left that space, I now had a much more open mind, and I was ready to receive what was ahead. And so I think God's prompting is sometimes leaving,
Hmm.
then leading,
Yeah.
instead of leading, then leave. And I
Yeah.
think we get that out of order.
Good. Good. Very good. Now, what helps you strengthen your faith to keep it a foundational priority? Because again, a lot of places and people and movements want your time and your energy. So how do you remember and how do you keep that a foundational priority?
Yeah, and as we work towards or through these podcasts, what we're going to find is our time is our number one resource.
Hmm.
And so how we manage our energy will be a direct byproduct of what we return. If I went and I worked out every day, I'm going to gain strength,
Hmm.
right?
Which you don't, but
Which I
yeah,
don't. That's why I
yeah,
said if.
yeah.
Thank you, Art, for recognizing that. At the same time, is whatever I invest my time in, if I invest my time in negative thoughts, I'm going to be more of a negative person. If I invest my time in positive thoughts, I'll be more of a positive person. And so that goes to that stated priority versus the lived priority.
So it's not time because we all have the same
That's
amount of
right.
time. It's
Energy,
energy.
energy. Where do I pour my energy in? Because I may have time and I pour my energy into other things, right? And then I come and the time's available for my faith and I'm exhausted.
Yeah.
And so I always prioritize my energy towards my priorities. And so then I'll give a framework in future podcasts on how to do that. But we prioritize our energy towards our priorities. And then we make sure that that energy is focused energy, right? One of the things that I know, if I'm passionate about, I'll be focused on it. But if I'm not passionate about it, I won't be. So I need to be passionate about those priorities too. And the first one for me is my faith. So then it's passion. So time just is easy to invest, and likewise energy, because it's something I'm passionate about.
Very good. Very good. Well, you and I share our faith in God. We have that in common. But tell us about a something tough that you navigated. I think people look at Reed Nyffeler and they see the CEO and he's successful and he has a lot of people and he could tell people what to do and he can make changes, and they don't realize that you weren't always there, and that you still have struggles just like anybody does, and you certainly had struggles coming up to be the place that you are. Tell me how your commitment to your faith in God and your commitment to making Him a foundation, you're the faith a foundation of your life. How did that help you navigate that time?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of two things: leaving and fear, right? Those are the things. I think fear is a principal driver of our behaviors, right? I mean, I think if you study the general public, the majority of the choices they make are around fear, either fear of not being enough, so I better do this, or fear of disappointing someone, or fear of not being recognized, right? And so I truly believe we're governed by our greatest fear, and that'll be illuminated in our decisions. So if we're afraid of not being liked, we'll do something to make people like us. If we're afraid of not having enough money, we'll become workaholics. If we're afraid of whatever it might be, we'll adjust our behavior accordingly. And that fear can be circumstantial, meaning in the moment, there's snakes, so I'm going to run away from them. Or it can be long term, right? That I'm always afraid of that, and that feeds our
Yeah,
insecurities.
fear's rarely a legitimate motivator.
That's right. And so early on in my life and career, I had to overcome those fears, right? Because I'm just like any other person. And so we can't, we're going to have fear. It's inherent in us, but we can choose what to fear. That's the difference. If we are going to have fear, we can choose what to fear. And so then, as I study the Bible, foundation of faith, God tells us to fear something, actually, believe it or not. Even God, who is the creator of all things, tells us to fear something. And what does he tell us to fear? Him. So if we're governed by our greatest fear and we must fear God, then the fear of being liked doesn't matter. The fear of not having enough wealth doesn't matter, because that supersedes those fears. And so then I said, if I'm ever in a moment where I'm afraid, say back to the point of leaving that job, and I'm afraid that if I leave that job, I won't ever find another one, or I won't be able to provide for my family, or I'll be kicked out of my house because I can't make the rent, or whatever the case might be. Then I'm governed by that fear. But if I fear God, then I said, hey, God, I'm in the middle. I'm in the waiting. You tell me where to go. And so I think it doesn't get easier as you get more responsibility. That leaving. And so I think many times we would rather suffer in our present state than take a half a step back by leaving, right? I was unemployed. I didn't have a path forward. In fact, I had to cash in my 401k to do this tough decision. I had to, I had never, even when I graduated college, I got paid more than when I started this, right? Even in high school, I was paid more than when I started this. So I had to leave all those things behind in order to get a return. And so I think that's the part is, right? I mean, imagine working for less than an hourly wage that a college graduate would earn when you started. And so those are the hard times. But I was never concerned about it, because my orientation was not, hey, that it's about income or measured metrics. It's more about living in the fear of God. God called me to leave. That was clear. I couldn't say it was more clear. And then he directed me where it was. And I said, okay, I'll live in this. I'll live in this for a period of time,
Yeah.
immaterial of what the world would say.
Yeah. We're going to learn more about that in the coming podcast. I'm kind of excited to hear all these stories. Well, thank you very much, Reed. Thank you for your time. Today, we talked about creating and clarifying a foundational priority in your life. I want to thank all of our listeners for joining us here in ReedFlections, a podcast on life, leadership, and learning. Next time, we're going to talk about family, focus on family. So get out there, be purposeful. I'm Art Calderon. Have a great day.
And you love to give me the last word. So thank you, Art. I appreciate that. You can always start all over again with your foundation of faith. There's no better time to start than today. And so, some of these principles you wish you would have known before, but I'll tell you, that's where the family comes next as a tie-in. If you make that decision today, it can affect multiple generations, and they will see that change in your life. And so don't wait. Today is the day to make that change in your life. Don't just listen to this podcast and drive on to the next destination. Really examine your life and say, hey, what am I foundation? Where's it built upon, and what's my priorities? And I would say, start with faith. So with that being said, we'll start on the family next week. Thank you for giving me the last word, Art.
As always.